I imagine that more people are going to be watching this on recording than live. So let me just say that we're recording this about 20 minutes after the verdict came down in the Derek Chauvin murder trial. And so obviously there are things that are more important that are going on today in the world than any of the things we're talking about. But that is, this is all part of building the big, broad movements that move us towards justice as quickly as we possibly can. And so if I seem a little, well, I confess I'm just moved and thoughtful today, and thinking very hard about George Floyd. And so we will do our best to honor his memory as we talk about some of the ways in which people are figuring out how to make this world a better place. It's a pleasure always to be at Power Shift. I've given talk at every Power Shift that there's been back long ago, because I'm an old person. And I was on the phone this morning with Jesse Tolkien, one of the people who founded this whole thing, and last week with Billy Parrish. And so I know what an important force Power Shift has been in many ways, including, and maybe one of the most important ways, serving as an opportunity for young people to figure out where in this movement they belonged, how they could make their way through it. And that's what we're about today. This career panel, one of several, is really about helping the people who are at this convergence explore different roles, different ways of making change, because the world changes in all kinds of ways, and we need all of them to work. We're obviously at an important moment now in the climate debate, and partly we're there because people have done a great job learning how to organize in the last 10 or 15 years. And partly we're there because engineers have done a great job in figuring out how to make renewable energy really affordable. And there are all different kinds of talents of all kinds. And you're going to be meeting some of them today. We're going to start by taking our 4 panelists today and having them each introduce themselves. Shane may be a little slow in joining us, but we've got a remarkable group of people who have figured out really important ways to make change. And I think we're going to start, if that's okay, Emily, in Washington, D.C., where Emily Norton is going to tell you about her work at the Institute for Policy Studies, which is going to tell you how she got there and how she sees the world too. Let me just say as she begins that for those who don't know it, IPS is one of the most important, well, I guess we'd call it a think tank in certain ways in the whole world. And I've been thinking about it a lot lately because its founder, Marcus Raskin, who I knew a little bit, it was his son, Jamie, that you watched, who was running the impeachment trial of President Trump later on. So IPS's long connection to movements and justice and political change is as important and vibrant as it ever was. And Emily, just tell us about how you got there and what you do and what the rest of us should be doing.
Well, I probably won't tell you what the rest of you should be doing, but thank you all so much for having me. This is actually my first Power Shift, so I'm really excited to be here. And I like sort of telling my story of how I got to IPS because it shows sort of my self-conscious college self. So when I got radicalized probably about my sophomore, junior year in college. So I grew up in the very Christian South, and I went to college hoping to study international development and had this time period in which I really became conscious of my white savior complex. And fortunately met an incredible professor. I don't know, many of you may have heard of her, Adrienne Pine at American University, who became a mentor to me. And I learned words to describe an experience I had on my study abroad when I was observing international development done in a really harmful way. So I learned the words nonprofit industrial complex. I learned about the prison industrial complex from her. And I discovered that there could be no job that I would have that would be ethical. I was just like, the trouble is everywhere. What am I going to do? And so I found that this professor donated to the Institute for Policy Studies and decided that's the only place that I could possibly work. And so I applied to every internship that I could there and started working on the demilitarization of the economy project they had there, and then quickly discovered more and more. And now 10 years later, I've been at IPS for a long time. I launched a leadership development program there, and I also started my career in organization development, which is sort of like, I liken it to sort of being a therapist for organizations. So it's trying to make sure that the work that we do is really effective on the outside, but that we're also really whole in the inside as well. So I sort of straddle both leadership development work there and organization development work, which I also do in a sort of private consulting practice outside of IPS. So that's a little bit about my story. Thanks.
Well, and it's a good story. Sharon, you're in Virginia, but you got into this work some at UTEP, yes? And now you're actually part of PowerShift itself. So you probably have more connections out into the world of young people at community colleges, at HBCUs, at universities all over the place than just about anybody else, and have a strong sense of what people are thinking about and where they're going. Tell us about how you saw the world and how you see it now.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Bill. So, hi, my name is Saren Glenn. I use they, them pronouns. I'm currently in Richmond, Virginia, but as Bill had said, I got a lot of my organizing start at the University of Texas at El Paso. And I'm currently working for the PowerShift Network as the HBCU and community college organizer, and also the main person who kind of interacts with non-traditional youth. And much like Emily, I love telling my story of how I got to PowerShift because it really does play out the very essence of me. One thing to know about me is I'm autistic, so the way you see me is the way I come all the way around. I'm kind of the same person, and you'll be able to get to understand what I mean when I begin to tell my story. So the main work that I focus on doing is destigmatizing anarchist and communist ideology and thought. Yeah, I'm talking about destigmatizing all the propagandized political ideology that the past 50, 100 years, has kind of wreaked havoc on the true essence of what different political ideologies and problem-solving ideologies could be out there. And so my job and my kind of life mission, as I found it, was to connect with young people, kind of understand where folks are coming from and see where they were at. And I hate to break it to you, but for those who don't know, a lot of young kids are communists. And I mean that somewhat in a lighthearted way. And for a lot of folks, they really understand the implications around capitalism and how it affects them individually a lot more than I think we give credit to. And so a little bit about my upbringing. I'm a former foster kid, orphan at 6 years old, in and out of group homes, family homes, aunts, uncles. I was your typical kind of like under the radar poor kid. You know, the one here you're like, did the teacher just braid her hair before we came into class? Or how come I never see, their parents around? I was that kid in public school. I didn't really have an adult looking after me. And so I kind of saw things without rose-colored glasses, but more so for really what they were. And at an early age, not only was it hard, but it helped me better understand the reality that a lot of people who lived under the poverty line, which for a lot of Americans in rural America, what their everyday life was. My dad was a Black Republican, and my mom was a white Democrat. And as you can imagine, that also played a role into the way that I saw myself growing up in East Texas in the 90s and early 2000s. Fast forward, I finally was able to get to go to college, and the struggle of multiple employment and self-education that took for me to be able to even get through school, which is something a lot of students who are poor and go through poverty have to deal with, whether that's finding a meal or figuring out the way to school. The fact that I was even able to get to college shows a lot of privilege on my end, honestly. But I was able to get to college, and from there on, I was inspired and radicalized from incredible professors at one of what people would say the least specialized universities in America. It was no Ivy League, and it was a 100% acceptance rate for a public school, but it was one of the most incredible places in the absolute world when it came to the reality of what was happening at the border. And it ultimately radicalized me as an individual to dedicate myself to connecting the very real realities of what people are going through with real problems that could make us problem solvers. And that included thinking outside of the box of the traditional Republican and Democratic ideology that we're dealing with today. So that's a little bit about the work I do. It leads me into the nonprofit sector in a way that disrupts, hopefully, the profit industrial complex and leads people to recognize an alternative for what we could hope for in the future.
Thank you so much for that description and also for your work, because it's so important. Tricia Clemens, you're in Kansas City today, but you come from in a certain way from a different world here, not as an organizer out in the world, but as someone who's often working on the inside to figure out some of these new technologies and figure out how to deploy them and get them out there. So you've probably had a somewhat different path going forward. Tell us about it and tell us what you like about what you're doing now.
Yeah. Boy, such great stories already. This is awesome. I love these kind of panels for that reason. Yeah, so Virtue Lab, the organization that I work with right now, we're nonprofit. We're based out of the Pacific Northwest, Portland. But in this remote environment, I'm able to be with my partner here in Kansas City, who is going to graduate school, actually just finishing. So, and then we'll be moving back here shortly. But we work at the intersection of entrepreneurship, innovation, investment, funding, and yeah, my role in that, I wear many hats in what I do, and probably hearing my story, it'll make sense of why I'm a bit of a generalist, and I do a lot of different things. I like to have my hands in all the cookie jars and help in a lot of different ways. My path to this was definitely not linear. I grew up in a small rural town, and going to college was not something that was heavily promoted or encouraged. My parents were blue collar. My mom even had a small business herself, but it was kind of, you can do just fine just going to work out of high school. And I loved working, and I really didn't care for school, actually. So that was perfect for me. So I dabbled, I stumbled around a bit, trying to figure out what I wanted to be when I grew up. But then for about 10 years, I found a really good fit for me. Actually as a force protection specialist, which was, I did a lot of bodyguarding, and I was actually a defense contractor and lived abroad for several years. Through a lot of that, I got to experience I got to have firsthand experience with people in violent situations, usually not showing up their best selves, that a lot of times was caused by inequities that, and other things that then later translated as I realized a lot of my own privilege throughout my life. And then I ended up having a partner who encouraged me to utilize that and do something more and have greater impact and actually go to college. And so at 32 years old, I went to college. And I kind of wanted to get into the neuroscience of things. That led me to biochemistry. I wanted to understand people, how we all have this same strange fleshy brain, yet it manifests in these different personalities. And again, kind of really wanting to tackle, why do people cause violence and harm and do these things? And it kept sort of resonating into, again, a lot of the inequities that are out there, the inability to have energy, the inability to, socioeconomic status and not having income or generational wealth. And I had a lot of knowledge about technologies. I was a biochemist, obviously, in school. I was researching certain things, but I did not want to do just one thing. There were a lot of people coming up with really cool technologies, and I really started to hone in on, when you have these technologies that can really have such great impact, how do you get those out to the people who need it? How do you get them into the big markets? How do you get Nike to make shoes out of material that will break down and not just end up in a landfill and become waste? And that's how I found our organization that really is focused on getting these new innovations out there into markets, into communities that then have the ability to help people who need the help the most, or markets that really need to have impact so that it's not releasing so much greenhouse gas and other emissions and polluting water, things of that nature. So that's a little bit of my story there, and I can definitely elaborate on any more of that.
That is a great story. And anybody who had a bodyguard on their bingo card for previous experience is doing very well now. And we will look forward to hearing much more about that and about your path and what you're doing. It's fascinating, and thank you for it. We've got one more panelist coming to us from Texas, from Austin. Shane Johnson, I think, is actually a native of Austin, which is a rare thing anymore in Austin, Texas. And he's done all kinds of things that he will tell you about. And he's working at the Sierra Club these days, which I guess makes him our token representative of Big Green and the all of that. But his story, I think, will indicate that he has a lot of different dimensions to his work. So Shane, you're there someplace. Welcome, and we're very glad to have you.
Thank you for having me, and I'm glad to be here as well. Can y'all hear me all right?
Yes.
Awesome. Yeah, and I'm so sorry I'm running late. I was waiting for an hour at the doctor's to get a knee examination, so I'm just getting back home right now. And I'll kind of play off of that. It's actually and hearing the other panelists' stories beforehand is really inspiring, particularly to be vulnerable in this space. Had a knee injury 5 or 6 years ago, and I'm getting starting the process to get a diagnosis right now. So growing up, I grew up kind of straddling the line of poor and kind of lower middle class, and rising up from there. But never went to the doctor, couldn't afford that. Couldn't even afford that in college, even though I had more class privilege than some of the other folks on this call, but definitely not wealthy folks in the U.S., middle class people. And I apologize, I realize I forgot my pronouns, he, him pronouns. And yeah, I'm a native of Austin, Texas, really bad gentrification here, so there's not much of us left. But I'm a mixed race, Black and white, cis guy, but I'm also have neuropsychological disabilities, like a previous person spoke about. And actually, kind of my parents misdiagnosed me as having autism, but I actually have severe OCD, which is there's a lot of popular media around that, but it's really an anxiety disorder that is, even for me, has characterized my life more than being a Black man. But I was always concerned about the injustice in the world around me, helping people, and trying to make the world a better place. Coincidentally enough, I got involved in Sierra Club organizing when I was in high school, and then I was really inspired, and I'm first generation college grad, first in my family, and I was really inspired by an article from your Do the Math tour, Bill, and the terrifying numbers of climate change at the time really helped galvanize me to get involved in organizing. And then I helped co-found Fossil Free Stanford, and we secured coal divestment in 2014. I think we were the 12th institution at the time to divest from the fossil fuel industry. So that was part of my journey. But then even, I was kind of the only lower income Black or brown person in the environmental space that I was in at Stanford. And so that was really formative for me, learning some of the mistakes of encroaching on or taking up too much space from other communities, while also kind of realizing that you can't be, there can't be climate justice or environmental justice defined by sort of more affluent and wider organizing. It has to come from the frontlines communities. And from there, I really shifted to focusing on improving the experiences of Black and brown and queer and trans on campus, and kind of took that experience with me back home to Austin, Texas, where I got involved with an organization called Austin Justice Coalition. And we organized to help defeat the first and win and defeat for the first time in the history of the city of Austin, a police contract in our city that would have almost bankrupted our city. But I really took that to heart, and I became a volunteer lobbyist right out of college for criminal justice reform. And I'm really proud to bring that experience into the environmental organizing I'm doing at Sierra Club, because we're now seeing so clearly all of these connections between the criminal legal system and the environment. Fossil fuel companies are funding police brutality, and they're funding elected officials who are doing nothing about the police brutality or protecting it and expanding that specific form of white supremacy. So I'm really excited to help train people in community organizing, how that can be a tool to hold ourselves and our allies accountable, specifically in pushing for anti-racist changes in the environmental space, and understanding how those explicitly connect to the white supremacy culture of the U.S. And I don't know if y'all mentioned it already, but the Derek Chauvin verdict, triple guilty, I think this is a really first of its kind moment in the U.S. And so I'm hopeful that this can bring about more positive change in such a white supremacist country.
Shane, thank you enormously. And thank you enormously for your work at Stanford. I remember now your name, and I remember well that day that the news came that Stanford was divesting from coal. That was a big early milestone on what's become probably the largest anti-corporate campaign in history. So thank you very much for playing a big role in that and for everything else. And yeah, thank you for getting us back to Minnesota. Apropos your other remarks, while we're thinking about Derek Chauvin tonight, let's remember too that there are a lot of other of our comrades out tonight working hard trying to stop Line 3 across Minnesota. Indigenous communities in particular that are doing a remarkable job of trying to block one of the worst projects we know about. And as people can, we'll all figure out ways to help. We've got a lot of people now joining in and listening. So first thing to say is, Laura, thank you very much for your help here running things. People can ask questions, yes, via the chat or the Q&A.
Chat is the best place for us to do questions today. Thanks for asking.
Go to chat and put questions in, and I'll keep an eye on them. And while we're waiting for them, since I'm theoretically a journalist, let me ask a question or two to get us started. And these are questions that are, well, I want to, I love this crew of people that we have here. So tell us, you can answer, I'm going to ask sort of two questions. They may be the same question for you, or they may be two different answers. Tell us about something, a really defining moment for you in your work, one of those moments when you knew what you were supposed to do, or when it really came together. and tell us something either specific or general that really brings you joy in the work that you do. I feel like I kind of need to hear this stuff because it's been a long year in a lot of ways. And sometimes it's a little hard in 2020, 2021 to quite figure out why we're doing what we're doing when it involves sitting and looking at each other on screens all day. So help us out a little bit here. Let's go in the same, maybe we'll go in the same order we went before just for ease here. So Emily, start us out. Tell us some stories.
So a defining moment that comes to mind now, especially being about, just a year in the anniversary of the beginning of COVID when things started shutting down, I was finishing my master's degree in organization development and working with a swing state Democratic Party that was getting ready to go in the primaries and had to change their entire organizing strategy as things started going remote. And so I was called in to work with the senior leadership team, and they were going to go and do a strategy session and have a retreat, and I was going to facilitate a part of it. And I just remembered coming in and there being this under the table friction. And this is all happening while, I'm in my own house and feeling like my world is just contracting to this, little room that I'm in. And I was really being called upon to expand in a way that I hadn't had to before. And I bring up this moment of going into the retreat and just realizing that there were multiple different conversations happening that were going past each other. Lots of mixed metaphors, a lot of friction. And so I paused in this moment and brought up this model that really speaks to me. So in my work, there's I focus on process. I'm a process consultant, meaning I hold the process and I let others be the owner of the content. So I'm not a climate organizer. I'm learning a lot about climate here, but I know a lot about how to get people in conversation with each other. And we just did a moment of pause to see where people were in their own transition, because a change is a moment, and we know that, and a transition is a process that is both emotional as well as sometimes physical. And the first step of a transition is a letting go or grief. Then we enter this sort of wandering no man's land, and then there's a new beginning. And so I had folks sort of stop and locate themselves and where they were and where their teams were on this process, and sort of reconnect to the emotional impact of having to go remote, while also helping their constituents think through what it meant to be in a moment of having to choose between their physical safety and voting. And I only bring that up here now in terms of defining because, when we think about work, I often think about tasks, and so much more of what we need is to connect to each other to be able to do what we need to do. There's this important human glue element that I think even in the best social justice organizations, we can sometimes forget because our work is so important. And I'm also thinking about it a lot for climate work specifically, as I've been talking to more and more Gen Zers who are experiencing literal transition and just needing to be able to name and connect with grief or the collective trauma that we're experiencing in a way that's meaningful for us doing our work together. So that's a moment that sticks out. And should I answer your second question quickly? I realize I'm talking quite a bit. I love the word joy because I've been thinking about how, we talked earlier before we started about how we're zoomed out. We've been in meetings forever. And I think a thing that gives me joy is being able to get really creative about how we meet with each other. I want this work that we do to be joyful and creative. And so that's a lot of what I try to figure out how to do, so that we're not just talking at each other, but there's more play in our work. And I've been really loving that. Also just being with you all, being with young people gives me so much joy and hopefulness. I feel like that sounds a little tacky because I've got this like gray streak now and I'm really trying to own it, but I really mean it.
You've got a long ways to go, believe me. And and I can't help but see the guitar behind you on the wall, so we won't make you play it. If you want to get it down, and
No, my partner is the guitarist. I'm the painter.
All right, good.
No guitar from me.
Sharon, your turn.
Would you like me to answer the same question, Bill?
Yes, absolutely, if you don't mind.
Well, so can you repeat the question for me?
Yes, talk about a kind of either a defining moment in your work or a really joyful one, and they might be the same thing.
Okay. So I'm gonna speak as a non-binary, queer, biracial person, Gen Z individual. Just wanted to fair share that autistic individual, because one of the most defining moments in my career was when I worked for a senatorial campaign, and a rather famous one. Beto O'Rourke ran for Senate in 2018 against Ted Cruz, and I worked as one of the larger state directors on the what side? San Pecos region, and in San Antonio. It's a huge part of Texas, and regional part of Texas. And honestly, it was heartbreaking, but defining, because I realized that it wasn't what it was supposed to be. It's not what they tell you. It's not what they sell you. And I'm going to be honest with that. For people who are like, should I join a political campaign? The answer is absolutely no. They will work you 106 hours a week. And then when you try to unionize, they will tell you that you're too slow and that you don't have it in you. And when I realized how fake it was, no matter what side of the aisle you were on, I realized that I wanted to do something about that. And that's why I joined PowerShift, so that I could be honest and not have to compromise my morals and my values and what I stood for and what I really believed in. And I didn't want to have to be sacrificed to the wolves in a predominantly white and predominantly neurotypical work environment, just because I was a person who fell within a marginalized group who wanted to change the status quo. So that was definitely one of the most defining moments for me. And as far as joy is concerned, I recently just kind of closed a chapter within my PSN life, which was leading a really incredible recruitment team for the PowerShift Convergence. And that team of 35 or so individuals and 12 really strong and close fellows to me were really, really, really joy-bringing and defining, because it created a sense of real community based on transparency that I hadn't seen in youth organizing spaces previously. And it was beautiful to see that I got to play a role in creating the space that I always wanted to see.
Fantastic. That's great. Tricia, you say same thing from your point of view.
Yeah, so I guess one of the things I didn't share about my journey is that I actually worked a couple internships, and one of them was with our organization, and that actually transitioned obviously into something permanent. But I ended up working in a contracting situation, and which was absolutely frightening, you know, leaving college and then working as a contractor. And I had some folks that kind of helped mentor me into that. But that happened because one of our directors, the director I was interning under, had started to convene a whole bunch of stakeholders around a project, and had ended up applying for a big grant from the EDA. And we ended up winning that grant to do all of this work. And then he left the organization, and as his intern, and our organization was going to lead that big collaboration. And I was the only one that really knew all the nuts and bolts, which ended up being super frightening, because it was working somewhere, I mean, definitely state and regional level, but with the people that had a lot of experience. And even though I was older and obviously felt capable, it was just imposter syndrome city, you know, really kicking in. But I really believed in the work and the project that we were doing. And so I sort of grew with that and grew my career into that. And it ended up being multiple years that it took that program to run, but it went beautifully. And it actually put not just Oregon, where the project was a company and a technology that we were trying to get into the market, but it put the US on the market as well in this particular space. And then I ended up obviously kind of earning a full-time position in the organization itself. And in that, one of the other hats I wore was to run our internship program. So I was an intern running or managing an internship program where we match students from colleges and universities with some of the tech startups we support. I still manage that program to date, but it's always a fun part of me where it comes full circle that I'm an intern or was an intern that now gets to give back. So I get to close that loop. And so I think that's kind of where all this ends is I get to feel that joy of connecting people to sometimes their first jobs. I get to experience that like pretty consistently. It's awesome.
That is fun. There's no question. Shane, your turn.
All right. So, and good to be on camera now. Yeah, the joy one is easier. The pivotal, it's hard to pick one, right? So, I mean, I mentioned one pivotal organizing moment was the police contract fight in Austin in 2017, 2018. And then I'll, kind of fast forwarding and super relevant was, George Floyd's murder, and with COVID having been overrunning everything for a few months, so the summer of 2020 and all the massive protests, then, folks are organizing around Austin to try to get, to start defunding the Austin Police Department, or as some folks like to say, stop overfunding. I'm a fan of just defunding the police in general, given they're, a pillar of white supremacy in this country, and they were founded as slave patrols, similar to how the Second Amendment was founded to arm militias and do slave patrols. But we were, the folks around the city turned out in a way that I'd literally never seen before in Austin. I kind of joke that, if Austin were a university, it'd kind of be Stanford, or if Austin were a nonprofit, it'd be one of the big greens. It's just, there's just so much apathy, and there are so many white people in Austin. And just to see people turn out, shut down the streets around around City Hall was so inspiring. And then a year before, the city council had, we fought tooth and nail to try to get them to not increase funding, to create new positions among the next police cadet class. And to be clear, these were positions that their own data showed that would be physically impossible to fill. So it'd be expanding the size of the cadet class, and they were not capable of filling the previous number of seats. And city council ignored us and increased that police budget, 6 months earlier. And then we go from that to saying, you need to defund APD. There was a little bit of push and pull among different parts of the Black community and other people of color, asking for 50% defunding or asking for 100 million. The budget was 440 million, so 100 million was a little less than a quarter. And it ultimately panned out to be an initial cut of just 20 something million, but then committing to withholding in the future almost $120 million in total funds, and figuring out what we're going to do with that over time. So that was, we fought tooth and nail and lost at about for about $1.5 million, and not increasing the police budget as opposed to actually decreasing it. We went from that to the community really turning out and shutting things down, and for the first time in modern history in Austin. And we could get up to $120 million moved out of the police and into the other needs in the city that have been badly underfunded: EMS, social services. We need social workers helping people out, not police. There's a very high, Austin police are one of the most brutal police departments and had one of the highest per capita rates of killing people. So we were really trying to, and they kind of had a reputation of anybody who had a mental health crisis who called 911 was then executed by APD. They were murdered by APD officers. So they created a program to try to stop that. So seeing all of those big changes was really inspiring, and I was really grateful that I was able to get paid to work on some of that through my job as an organizer of Sierra Club, because fighting environmental racism, fighting for racial justice, and fighting against white supremacy is all interconnected. So it was nice to get paid for that work for the first time. And then quickly on the joy side, I have to say that Sierra Club unionizing fully was really the biggest joy of this recently. So last fall, Sierra Club National, and for those who don't know, Sierra Club is essentially a network of nonprofits. There are over 60 Sierra Club nonprofits, which is kind of crazy. And National had already unionized, but the chapters, which were primarily kind of state level, had not. So unionizing got me a almost $12,000 raise immediately. So that was a very nice to have. And our union, PWU, Progressive Workers Union, stands in solidarity with all the other kind of big green organizations that are trying to unionize, 350, Union of Concerned Scientists, many others. So hopefully all these other workers can get those benefits as well. But yeah, already had great benefits, and then which I can now go to the doctor and get a diagnosis for problems that I've had for years, and now I'm not getting underpaid on top of that. So that's been a joy.
Fantastic. That is good news. There's a bunch of really good questions in the chat, and I'm going to try and kind of combine a few of them, and sort of, because I think it sounds like people really want some advice around what in the HR world they call work-life balance and things, but some of them are very particular. Some of that's kind of particular to the work that a lot of y'all do, because you do the kind of work that can be all-consuming. They can just take over what you're thinking about and doing. So how do you balance that with with having a kind of normal life with the people around you who aren't consumed by the same things you are, and how do you keep from, and this may be a kind of, for some of you, the answer to this may lie, the second question may lie in the first. How do you kind of keep from overworking yourself in the end and feeling like it's on you to save everything? Because that can get kind of tiring and overwhelming. So let's mix it up a little bit. Saren, you go first this time, if you don't mind.
Absolutely. Thank you, Bill. It's honestly hard, and it's funny that we get this question while I'm in the middle of a burnout. Especially, I love the power shift convergences, and also I work for the convergence, so I am tired. But in all seriousness, I take my self-care really seriously. I haven't had an easy life, and I'm not hiding that from nobody. Not myself either. I don't need to be polite on myself at home. I can be honest. I had a hard ass life. I now have insurance and a nice king size bed. I can afford a weighted blanket, and I can use my off days. I'm gonna use them. And I'm not gonna be kind on myself, or I'm not gonna be hard on myself for it. I think we have to look at the way that we give so much compassion and so much patience to the processes and the systems around us. And we need to give it to ourselves. We need to radically care about ourselves. And I think for me, part of the reason why I'm into my work, or into the work that I do, is absolutely because I care about the community, and also because those community members are just like me. And I know if I don't want to live that kind of life, why would they want to live that life? And I use that same kind of like narrative to my own self-application with my work. It's like, I would not want to hire someone and tell them to work day in and day out and not, you know, exercise any kind of like self-restraint or self-love. Why would I do that to myself? I radically have to love myself enough to really invest myself in this change, because it's because I love myself so much that I like have nothing else to lose. I think when we talk about the fight against anti-capitalism or the fight against these systems, this work is extremely engulfing and overwhelming and heartbreaking. And I go to therapy, individual therapy once a week. I go to couples therapy twice a month. I mean, I'm being completely honest. I have a cat who I love like my child, and I make sure that I, you know, take my meds on time and have safe foods, if I'm being real honest. And that is how I get through the day. And if that's what it takes for anybody else, go for it. I have tattoos and piercings, and I don't make excuses for the things that I need to do, you know, I need to do them for myself. So
That's therapy, weighted blankets. These are all good things and many more. Trisha, how do you deal with this? Like how do you deal with people who aren't as completely engaged, Trisha, in I mean, how do you step away? This kind of work can be so absorbing. How do you sort of step away from it in some kind of normalcy sometimes?
Well, that's kind of the thing. I mean, I think a lot of us, we want to be like 5 different people, you know, we want to do all the things, and I overcommit all the time to things, and I struggle with anxiety. I'm very transparent with that, and I've put things in place and had open conversations with my colleagues at work, and even and being able to have some influence over our culture and the language, and accepting that sick days also translate as mental health days potentially, and using that. Does that qualify? Yes, you know, and moving and having that kind of conversation. I need that in place, because like what Saren's talking about, some days like I typically don't get like maybe physically sick, but I burn out mentally, and I need a day in bed, just as if I were sick, I would take a day in bed. So, and being okay with that, struggling with being a perfectionist as well, being okay with that I'm not good at everything. And so therapy, for sure. I'm so glad you mentioned that, because Sarah, when you were talking, I thought, that's what I'm gonna say, therapy, for sure. So, and I love that I have a job that supports that, but that is part of my routine. And it's a constant thing for me to always be okay with that. I can't do all the things, and that sucks, because I want to do all the things. I want to have more impact. And so one of the ways that it makes me feel better is to see and meet other people who are doing great work, that it's not my field, it's not my expertise, but it does help alleviate that other awesome people are working on these things, so that I can show up in a space that I'm doing awesome work in this space, and that other people, like the rest of us on this panel, you know, can know that I'm playing my part in here, and you guys are playing your part there, and collectively on a whole across the globe, there's a whole bunch of awesome people like us doing a lot of really great work. And that helps me sleep a little better at night, even though I do struggle with sleep a lot too.
That's powerful, very powerful. Shane, you were talking before about your OCD and things, so you must have had to evolve some real strategies for how you separate life and work a little bit, and what the role is of people who aren't necessarily engaged in these fights all the time in your life and things.
Yeah, that's a great observation. I would say that it's taken a while, and I was very bad at self-care for a very long time, which is a very not good thing. Yeah, I would say, you know, learning to practice better self-care, especially when you're like somebody like me who has an anxiety disorder, and that centers around, you know, not stopping, and there's always something more to do. You know, there's in TV and whatnot and shows, there's, you know, it's always somebody with OCD is washing their hands too much, or, you know, they're like a great inventor, something kind of silly like that. But really, it's like your brain just doesn't turn off, and there's always an extra what if, or or an extra branching idea off of what you're thinking and doing. So kind of my brain is wired differently to not stop. And so that's been a lifelong journey for me to unlearn, kind of like how a lot of folks have to unlearn the habits they develop out of white supremacy culture. You know, it takes years to be able to change how you intuitively react based off of race. It can take years. It's taking me years to really unlearn. And you know, it comes out of capitalism and patriarchy as well. I need to exert my dominance. I need to be as productive as possible and control things. So it's taken me years to unlearn that and unlearn how that's kind of been amplified by my own OCD as well. So yeah, taking several years of therapy have really gotten me to being able to function on a day-to-day basis in a way that isn't undermining my own mental health. And I'll be honest, I'm really just starting to practice self-care in the last 5 months. And I literally told myself the first half of 2020, you can wait until after the 2020 election for self-care. And that was really bad. That definitely backfired. I burned out. I got sick multiple times, thankfully not COVID, but in the lead up to right before the election. And it really showed me how, you know, your health is everything, right? So you need to prioritize your health. And I like to say that, you know, existence is resistance, but thriving is radical resistance. So we need to do what we need to do for ourselves what we need to thrive and not just get by. Trying to catch up on sleep. I've had a bad chronic insomnia that's made the anxiety and OCD worse over the last 2 years. So getting a diagnosis for that, you know, practicing self-care and just taking time to recharge and hang out with friends more, get a good laugh. I kind of joke that the pharmaceutical industry hasn't turned laughter into a pill yet. So that's your free anti-anxiety medication. At least for me. So those are the things I try to do.
Those are excellent. That's very powerful. And don't give Big Pharma any ideas about laughter. Would be my Emily, you finish us off here on this question, if you don't mind.
Sure. I really am appreciating the amount of vulnerability and the responses, because I think I'm just now really, really learning this for myself. I worked, 2 to 3 jobs for the last many years, did grad school at the same time of working. They really struggle with resting. And I think, there's this inclination that I have that I see in a lot of people that's like, once I'm aware of a thing that I'm bad at, that I assume that I can immediately jump into like mastering a change really well. Whereas there's all these other steps that would need to happen first, like me becoming aware of what's going on, accepting an aspect of it, adopting or trying out new behavior, then integrating it, and then I'll get there. And I'm really just at awareness. And I think the awareness piece that feels important for me presently around self-care is trying to at least get granular about when I'm numbing or when I'm resting, which feels really tricky during COVID right now. And just trying to see like, what is actually nourishing me? Can I get really, really micro about these moments in my day? And then just trying to, with the acceptance piece, add a little bit more softness to myself. And for me, I think that a way that I do that is trying to think about less of like, what am I doing all the time for a movement? I clock out at 5 and then I got to go do this thing because, somehow in my work life, that doesn't count as like being active enough, and being like, no, these values that are really transformative to us can be transformative into my tiny moments too. If I'm just trying to get a sense of like what it would mean to be whole, and that being an activist or being in this work doesn't have to just be a doing sort of thing. So that's a shift that I'm now moving towards, sort of that experimenting with.
That's really, really profound and helpful. Laura, I think we're running up against the end of things, and we're going to have to send people off, remind them that the Opportunity Fair is happening now and you can access it on the schedule, and that there are going to be more career panels, I think, in the next hour. But I just really want to say extraordinary thanks to all of you for all you're doing in your daily lives, because it's incredibly important and helpful, but also for all that you've said today. I was reflecting as everybody was talking with a little bit of sadness on my own part that, you know, when I was your age, I mean, literally none of the stuff that we've talked about for the last half hour would ever have come up in anybody's life. We wouldn't have even talked about things in those terms. And it's awfully good that you are. And it's awfully good advice to all the people who are listening in to sort of be thinking, we only get the one life. And so it's a serious, good, and beautiful thing to take it seriously the way that y'all are doing. And I just could not be more grateful to y'all. So on we go. And pretty soon we'll even have shots in our arms and be able to do this in person and give each other a hug and say thank you that way. But for now, just know that that what you're doing is awfully important. And this was really great. Thank you so much.